My name is Tom Wortman, and I'm the president of the Rotary Club of Chapel Hill, and we are happy and proud to be presenting this climate change series in partnership with the Meadowmont Aging in Place program and UNC's Wellness Center, and support from, I think, 2 or 3 other organizations. So welcome, everyone, and we will adjourn by 6 o'clock. We have a pretty exciting program tonight, and I know I'm looking forward to it. And to introduce our speaker tonight is Gary Barnes, also from the Rotary Club and the MAP program. Gary?
Thanks, Tom. Well, I'm happy to introduce Noah Kittner. He is assistant professor in the Department of Engineering and Environmental Sciences at UNC. UNC is the school where he did his undergraduate work. He's a native of North Carolina from Raleigh, earned his PhD and master's degree from Berkeley, and was a Fullbright Fellow in the Joint Graduate School of Energy and Environment in Thailand, where he researched technical and policy aspects of solar-generated electricity. He, interestingly to me at least, installed solar panels in Mexico, I think with Engineers Without Borders. He's conducted extensive research with a number of units, most recently the Group for Sustainability and Technology since 2018, I think. And he is the author of numerous articles on the use of technology and energy sources that promote sustainability and reduce our carbon footprint. So Noah, you can say it so much better than I can. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And it's really nice to meet you all and be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you about global climate change and energy technologies. I prepared a few slides for us today just to talk through an introduction to the relationship between energy and climate. So this may be an introduction for some of you, and some of you may be a bit more familiar, and I'll plan to answer any of your questions. So also, I'd like to keep this so that you're able to ask questions, or feel free to use the chat or raise your hand, and I'd be happy to be interrupted and answer any questions you might have. As you are aware, I'm an assistant professor in environmental sciences and engineering in the School of Public Health at UNC, and I've been here now in Chapel Hill for 4 years, and I grew up as well in North Carolina. So it's really nice to connect to all of you and talk with you all about climate change and energy. So I wanted to start out just by giving you a picture of where we get our electricity from in the US and how rapidly that is now changing over the past decade. So we're undergoing a pretty rapid transition in the electricity sector. And as you can see in this picture here, we can see how for the past 70 years, coal has been, or even more than that, coal has been the dominant form of electricity generation source for the US. And in the past 10 to 20 years, there's been a pretty quick change in the way we're getting electricity in particular. And so the implications of this transition for climate change are pretty stark. We've seen a pretty rapid rise in the use of natural gas for electricity, and also renewables are now, including hydropower, have recently surpassed nuclear power in terms of the total amount of electricity that is generated. This is just for the US. But globally, we have a large challenge. And in order to deal with the transition where we have many incumbent technologies like coal and natural gas, and new technology entrants that are include solar and wind that are variable, we may need a smart, resilient system and new types of infrastructure that actually enable our energy system to process and utilize a higher share of variable renewable energy. So an important part of my work in my talk today is to explain how the technologies that now exist give us an ability to reduce some of the large impacts of climate change, and our energy system is one of the contributing factors to climate change in a way that may be a potential solution. So, for instance, the three main things I want to talk to you about are: one, climate change is happening now, and so there's an urgent opportunity to address some of the most negative impacts of climate change by changing our energy utilization and switching out new sources of electricity generation and in transportation. We also know that energy is a major contributor to climate change, so therefore taking advantage of these technological innovations is going to be really important for our future. And I'm going to tell you about what we can do to reduce emissions and ways that we may be able to manage this transition in a better way. So I wanted to start out just with a picture of the greenhouse gas emissions in 2018. And this is a large and could potentially be a complicated diagram, but I really like it because what it shows is it links different sectors of our economy to carbon dioxide emissions and CO2, methane emissions, which is represented by CH4, nitrous oxide and fluorine gases that all are greenhouse gas pollutants and contribute to temperature increases. And what we can see is that as of 2018, electricity and heat are of the largest sectors contributing to CO2 emissions. And the energy sector and energy system that incorporates electricity and heat, buildings, transportation are all major contributors to climate change. So a focus on changing the energy system to one that has a lower CO2 footprint is really important in terms of reducing our CO2 emissions. You can also see that industrial processes, agriculture, deforestation, land use change are also contributors to CO2 emissions, but energy by and large is one of the largest sectors to focus on. And to give some historical context, electricity and heat actually used to represent a much larger share of our CO2 emissions. But with the increase in advance in renewable and low carbon electricity technologies, we've been able to significantly reduce the contribution of electricity and heat to CO2 emissions. And now there's a lot more focus. You may have heard in the news about decarbonizing the transportation sector. And by decarbonizing, I mean going from a system that is mostly dominated by high carbon fossil fuel energy sources to one that has nearly zero carbon emissions. And that could be done by using electricity potentially in other sectors for transportation. But that's also a challenge that we have in terms of how do we reduce the CO2 emissions for large sectors like buildings, industrial processes, and agriculture. I also want to give you a bit of a background in terms of the way that or the contribution of primary energy sources to the energy system in the US. So this is a snapshot of the US energy consumption in 2021. And it may look like a complicated series of flows and diagrams, but what I want to alert your attention to are a few things. So on the left side, we have the different primary energy sources, or essentially the key resources that provide energy that we can use in our economy. Some of those sources are converted to electricity generation. So that's what we're using in our houses when we plug in our appliances and anything that uses electricity. We also need energy to power our cars and move around, and that's where a lot of our petroleum fuels are going toward creating gasoline that's used for transportation in the US. And additionally, we use energy in other ways, like for heating buildings and industrial purposes. And that is where natural gas is a very flexible fuel and contributes to many different sources. So just to take a step back, we have electricity generation, which is one part of our entire energy system, but is not the only way the only use of our energy. And in order to deal with climate change, a lot of people have proposed to increase our electricity generation. And the reason is that right now, our electricity comes mostly from coal, natural gas, some nuclear power, a little bit of solar, some hydropower, wind, and geothermal electricity. But in the future, because we've made a lot of technological progress in the ability to use solar electricity and wind electricity effectively, we could actually replace the natural gas and coal in the electricity generation with low carbon electricity alternatives. And that could also include nuclear power. Now, we're also using gas, and you may be familiar with this if you have a gas furnace for heating in your home. Some people are using gas for residential heating. There are now incentives through the Inflation Reduction Act to subsidize the cost of electric heat pumps, which would use electricity instead of natural gas to meet the heating needs for buildings, mostly houses or commercial buildings across the US. What you also might notice from this chart is that of the electricity generated in the US, we have a large chunk, about 2/3 of that electricity that's being generated is actually wasted in terms of rejected energy, and that's actually waste heat. So it takes more primary energy. All of these energy resources like coal or natural gas or solar, it takes more of that primary energy, and we have to convert that into electricity. And because it's not a 100% efficient process, we do lose a significant amount of energy to heat. Now that varies based on the type of electricity generation, but as you can see that natural gas and coal are currently the majority share of our electricity generation. That's those technologies range in their efficiencies. Some plants are maybe 50 or 60% or even less, 30 or 40% efficient. So this is an issue for our energy system in general. So this is a snapshot of where the energy system was in 2021, but you might be curious, well, how does this relate to future decisions and climate change? And that's a lot of petroleum that's contributing to the transportation sector. Well, we have a lot of work to do because in terms of the climate problem, there's somewhere around 600 gigatons of CO2 that we have left to emit before we experience 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade warming on average, which has many effects of climate change. As you can see, the annual CO2 emissions are somewhere between 40 and 50 gigatons per year that globally we are emitting. And part of the challenge, if you think of it from a budget perspective, is that either we have, because CO2 lasts a very long time in the atmosphere and has a very long residence time, the CO2 we put into the air today will last for almost the next century. And because of this, there's a pretty urgent need to dramatically reduce the annual amount of CO2 emissions that are being emitted each year. So some people have posed this problem from a management perspective. If we have a limited budget of, we know that it's not going to be an immediate drop off from 40 to 50 gigatons of CO2 per year to zero, but there's going to have to be some kind of transition in order to be able to continue our economic activities that are powered by energy and find ways to manage these resources. Well, since we know energy is such a large contributor to these 40 to 50 gigatons per year of CO2 emissions, we can also look at it in the electricity sector as an opportunity to go from a very carbon-intensive electricity sector to one that uses much lower carbon electricity technologies. And I know this is a pretty dense chart, but what I want to highlight is the order of magnitude and difference of the greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 emissions that are emitted per terawatt hour of electricity from sources like coal compared to natural gas and nuclear and wind and solar. What you can see is that coal electricity is, for every terawatt hour of coal that's being generated, there's about 1,000 kilotons of CO2 emitted. And so this is a really large amount. What you can see from this chart is that natural gas is about a little bit less than half of that in terms of its CO2 equivalent. So if you think of it just from the perspective of switching from coal to natural gas, we're making some inroads in terms of the CO2 emissions per terawatt hour. But when we look at other options that exist, like hydropower, nuclear electricity, wind, and solar, we see that there's only maybe between 2 to 10 kilotons of CO2 emitted per terawatt hour, and most of that is just embodied in the materials that are required to build the power plant in the first place. And so because we have this opportunity, this is pretty striking because we know how to make electricity now in a cost-effective way on a large scale that competes with coal and natural gas. And we also can see that if we replace coal, for instance, you could get nearly a 100 times greater benefit, and depending on the exact CO2 emissions per terawatt hour of electricity from different sources. And even with natural gas, you can cut the emissions pretty quickly. But you can also notice that solar and wind are really a fraction of the emissions from natural gas as well. So this is motivating the use of lower carbon electricity generation technologies. But what's the holdup, you might ask? Well, coal and natural gas have some features that have allowed them to dominate the electricity space for a long time. They are very reliable and can provide electricity almost all the time. So one of the big technological challenges is getting renewable energy to compete with what's called baseload fossil fuel electricity, where you could have 24/7 reliable access to electricity from variable sources like wind and solar and hydropower. I just want to show you a picture of a natural gas combined cycle power plant because some of you may not have seen one before. And the reason that I'm showing you this is that in the US, we've seen an increase over the past decade in the use of natural gas to produce electricity. Natural gas combined cycle power plants are more efficient than their counterparts that are just one combustion gas turbine, because what they do is they incorporate a gas turbine and then they capture some of the waste heat and generate more electricity through an extra steam turbine. So all of the excess heat from the initial gas turbine, some of it is captured and used essentially to boil water to create steam, and then create a secondary process which produces even more electricity. And these power plants are about 66% efficient. But this is still a challenge in terms of the fact that we have between 300 and 500 grams of CO2 for every kilowatt hour that's being generated from natural gas. And there's also methane that's in the natural gas pipeline. So if we want to replace some of these electricity technologies with other options, there are a number of questions about, well, what can solar or wind or these other variable renewable energy technologies do? Just from a standpoint of listing out some of the emerging alternative technologies to generate electricity, there are alternative options to a natural gas combustion turbine. That includes solar photovoltaics. So these are the solar panels that you may have seen on farms in North Carolina. We have the third most installed utility scale solar farms. So these are mostly ground mounted systems, and many of them have been installed in places in eastern North Carolina that formerly were tobacco farms or other agricultural lands, and now they're being used to generate solar electricity. This technology also can be used on the roof of people's houses, so you could generate your own electricity. And and we can come back to the merits of rooftop solar later on. We also are experiencing I would say a renaissance in onshore and offshore wind turbine technology, because many of the wind turbine technologies that were being developed and installed 10 or 20 years ago were on the megawatt scale. which is millions of watts of joules per second that are being generated. But many of the offshore wind facilities that are being developed now are scaling up almost to the gigawatt scale, which is millions of joules per second or millions of watts. So, I mean, excuse me, billions of joules per second. So the scale and economies of scale in wind turbine production has been really immense, and now has allowed us to develop more cost-effective gigawatt scale wind turbines. There's other electricity generation technologies that are on the horizon. There's been discussion of geothermal to provide electricity, and in some countries that has been more effective than others, including places like Iceland or in Scandinavia, where there are a lot of geothermal resources. There's also interest in new types of innovative hydropower technologies, where we're using water resources and gravity to generate electricity. Additionally, even though there haven't been very many new nuclear plants being built in the US, there's been a lot of attention on the possibility to use small modular reactors as a potential technology that could be used on the megawatt scale to provide reliable electricity that complements different renewables. Also, we've seen a lot of attention to hydrogen, particularly in the recent Inflation Reduction Act, which provides many different production tax credits to incentivize the production of hydrogen gas. And especially within hydrogen, people are excited about using low carbon wind and solar electricity as a feedstock to split water. And you know that water is H2O. And if you remember from chemistry, if you split apart H2O, you'll get some part H2, which is hydrogen, and the other part would be oxygen or O2. And if you use electricity to split this water, we could capture hydrogen and use it in a gas or liquid form that in the future could potentially substitute for natural gas fuels. And because hydrogen in this way, which is referred to as green hydrogen, when you're using renewable clean electricity to split water to produce hydrogen, that production pathway is almost zero CO2 emissions that are directly combusted. And so even though hydrogen has some of its own potential pitfalls in that it may require a lot of that renewable electricity to generate 1 kilogram of hydrogen, there are some aspects of it where we could use hydrogen directly in some of these combined cycle natural gas plants as a way to generate low carbon electricity, or potentially store some variable electricity. So for instance, if there's too much sunlight or too much wind at a time, then potentially we could reroute that electricity to produce hydrogen and store that hydrogen as a gas or liquid to then use it in different circumstances later on. So this is a exciting area, but still limited in its deployment or actual applications across the US thus far. And on this list, I have lithium-ion batteries and long-duration energy storage, because energy storage may be one of the missing critical components of our ability to generate very low carbon electricity at a large scale in the United States and around the world, because we may need to complement solar and wind with some kind of extra boost of generation, especially since it's not always sunny, or sometimes the wind isn't always blowing. And so to deal with this variability in solar and wind and have reliable electricity like we would wish to have, energy storage all of a sudden becomes a really critical component of the ability for renewable electricity to compete with the traditional technologies like natural gas combustion turbines, coal power plants, and nuclear power plants. So this is a major area where there's a lot of research being done in terms of what storage technologies exist, their potential in terms of their cost effectiveness, and also whether they are technologically ready to be deployed at a large scale for us to meet some of these challenges. I also wanted to just highlight a few variations of some of these energy technologies that are potentially of interest. So in North Carolina, for instance, we have one of the largest floating solar installations in the United States, and floating solar is becoming a more popular form of solar PV generation globally. It's still a pretty small share of the total number of solar installations, but what's really interesting about floating solar is that for places where we don't have a lot of land available to just put a lot of solar panels, we could use existing reservoirs or some parts of water bodies to generate electricity. And in flood-prone areas, this may also be an interesting option. So there's a lot of new innovations that are happening, not just in terms of transitioning from coal or gas to using solar and wind plus storage, but even within the type of solar PV technologies that are being developed, a lot of the innovations are around the racking systems and also the anchors and floats to be able to move around solar. And what's really interesting about solar as compared to some of these other electricity generation technologies I mentioned before is that solar is quite modular. And so, for instance, with a floating solar array, these systems could potentially be packed up and moved in the future if that was deemed to be necessary. And so while this is a pretty small project and would only provide electricity for several hundred homes potentially, there's an opportunity in the future to scale up much further. I also mentioned that offshore wind turbines are undergoing a lot of innovation. Part of this is the actual structures themselves. Many of the offshore wind turbines that are being developed now that are several hundred megawatts or up to a gigawatt in scale are enormously tall. These turbines have been able to scale up in terms of their power capacity, but also have become more cost effective. And up until recently, there haven't been so many offshore wind projects being developed in the US, but now there's offshore wind being explored on the Pacific, in California, and also in North Carolina and Virginia. There's a few new offshore wind plants that are under development and installation now that provide a much more stable resource of wind power than some of the land-based counterparts. One of the downsides with wind electricity is that unlike solar, you can't really just place it wherever you want the wind turbines really benefit from being placed in places that have high wind speeds and reliable wind speeds. So part of the extra cost with wind is not just building the actual structures themselves, but investing in the extra transmission capacity to move the electricity from the coast to places where people live and are using that electricity onshore. So this is an area where there's innovation in the size of the generation technology, but it may require some further coordination and investment in transmission systems to be a real solution. So I'm sorry that I'm showing you so many charts, but I think this one in particular tells a really interesting story. And it's called the duck chart because it looks like a duck. This is a chart that shows over the course of a day. So we can see from midnight to midnight how much electricity is being used by the grid in California. And this is a historical chart showing how much electricity was needed at every hour for a day in March in 2012, and then 2013, 2014, all the way through 2020. And the reason it's called the duck chart is because it looks like a duck, and the belly of the duck is actually growing. And the reason it's growing, and this is a picture from California, is that there's a lot more solar electricity that's been installed on the grid. And that solar is taking away power that the utilities would otherwise provide during this period where there's daylight. So from 9 a.m. to about 6 p.m. This introduces some new challenges in terms of the way that the utility companies can provide reliable electricity for customers. And that's why energy storage might be one of the key missing links to having a more reliable system. So for instance, if there's a lot of extra solar during the middle of the day, there could sometimes potentially be too much solar. And if we have some kind of battery technology or other storage device that could take advantage of this low cost and abundant solar electricity at 1 or 2 p.m. when the sun is strongest, then we could use that electricity later in the day, such as at nighttime when the solar goes away. The other major challenge that didn't previously exist is that now that there's a lot more solar on the grid in California, you can see that when the sun starts to set, there's about a 3-hour period from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. where the utilities need to provide about 13,000 extra megawatts in only a 3-hour period. And previously, these types of ramping situations, like when the sun is setting, wasn't really an issue or was more of an afterthought. So because now that there may be periods of times when a lot of extra power capacity is needed for a short period of time, energy storage and other technologies may be the missing link to be able to have a reliable electricity system that is also manageable. And currently, if you don't have energy storage and you have to meet this ramp, usually some natural gas, they're called natural gas peaker plants, are turned on to be able to meet this very short ramp. So, oh, thanks. So, so this is happening, and so this is just to give you a sense of the scale. I definitely want to leave time for questions. So, I was asked to introduce a few different technologies. There's also pumped storage hydropower that's emerging, and so this is basically using gravity, and you could and the limitation of pumped storage hydropower for a long time has been that it's limited in where you could actually site it. But in the future, we may see that there's closed loop systems that could use that could be implemented in different places that have an elevation difference. And that's actually the largest battery that exists today, so more so than lithium ion storage. Some other emerging technologies include gravity energy storage. So that could be actually lifting concrete blocks on a crane, and in a very organized and algorithmic way, you could release that energy. And this is a bit more in the weeds, but what I want to show you is that the cost of these storage technologies has decreased dramatically over the past 2 decades. And so because of that, we now have this opportunity to invest in storage and utilize it, but it may be a challenge in terms of the timing of what's necessary to get to a near zero carbon electricity sector based on where we are today, and integrate all these higher shares of wind and solar in the grid. And so I wanted to leave you with this chart. So this is showing how much storage capacity has existed in the US grid from 2015 to 2025 in terms of the projected installations. And you can see that there was almost none in 2015 or 2016. And now there's over 7 gigawatts, and there's planned to be nearly 30 gigawatts by 2025. And so this could be really the missing link in terms of utilizing a lot more renewable electricity on the grid, and also being able to meet our climate change goals while transitioning our energy system from one that's fossil fuel based to one that uses a lot lower carbon sources. So I think solar will play an important role in meeting these targets. The Inflation Reduction Act provides a lot of new economic opportunities and tax credits for different solar and wind systems that may contribute to this clean energy transition. But one of the limiting factors now is the amount of actual energy storage that's currently on the grid. And so it's not actually the amount of solar and wind that I would argue is necessarily needed to further decrease our CO2 emissions, but actually energy storage systems that would allow us to utilize the solar and wind that we already have built, because a lot of that is not necessarily getting utilized in the most efficient way. And we have the technologies today to do this cost effectively, but the challenge, I think, is the will to change, and also incentives that the utility companies may have to continue their business as usual technology assessments. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And I wanted to ensure that we have plenty of time for questions. So please feel free to jump in with your questions or other discussion.
Noah, how optimistic are you that we can keep our global warming below 2 degrees centigrade or 1.5?
Well, I don't think that we're going to. I don't think we're going to make the 1.5 degree target. I mean, even the IPCC has now moved beyond that as a likely outcome. It used to be these what are called representative concentration pathways, or essentially the IPCC had these projections of a worst case scenario where there might be 8 or 9 degrees of warming, and that's really unlikely to be the case. But we're on track right now, somewhere in 3 to 5 degrees, unless there are other pretty dramatic changes to the way that we generate energy, electricity in particular, use energy, and also our transportation and agricultural sector will play a pretty big role as well.
You mentioned the increasing number of solar farms in eastern North Carolina. I have been some in northeastern North Carolina and have noticed a number. Is the market for the electricity generated largely in Virginia for those? There's not a large human population in that area. And so I wonder who's buying the power.
Yeah, well, actually, a lot of that, I believe, Duke Energy, it's in their service territory. So probably a lot of it is being used across the Carolinas, in North Carolina and South Carolina. But I do know that for the offshore wind facility that's being built in the Outer Banks, actually Dominion Energy is the main contractor for that, and a lot of that electricity will actually go to Virginia. So I think most of those solar farms are being used in North Carolina, but we are transmission constrained. And so some of the solar companies in Eastern North Carolina have complained about not being able to sell as much electricity as they're actually producing because of some of the infrastructure limits.
Okay.
So I have a quick question. You mentioned only the diurnal variability, which is the duck curve. What is your, and you said that can be done with batteries, which is true. How do you propose to fill the gaps in the seasonal variation, which is pretty significant for both wind and sun? In fact, I don't know of any solar installation that has capacity utilization more than 35%. So how is that going to be filled?
Yeah, well, this is a great question and requires even longer discussion. So seasonal storage is going to be tricky. I mean, hydrogen could potentially play a role in some of that, as there could be a use of storing some hydrogen gas or liquid hydrogen to get us through different seasons, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I think having a diverse set of options will help. In the short term, there may be combinations of carbon capture and storage with on existing natural gas facilities, or we might need to. I mean, if you increase the amount of offshore wind electricity in certain places, and you combine that with solar, you could dramatically reduce the amount of total storage that's needed on that system. But there also needs to be other forms of electricity, and particularly in places where there's maybe a lot of solar electricity in the summer and not as much in the winter, that seasonal storage could be a really important piece. In the far future, there could be forms of gravity storage or other potential reserves. But this is an area where I think there needs to be a lot more R&D investment to understand the implications of that.
Can I get back to HVAC systems, and if what's in the Inflation Reduction Act that might cause pretty significant change in the way we build those?
Oh, well, yeah, so the Inflation Reduction Act has some direct subsidies to switch to electric heat pumps, for instance. So there's a $2,000 tax credit for anyone switching from a gas furnace to an electric heat pump. And that credit actually increases based on your income, or if you're lower income or below the area median income, then you could qualify for even more tax credits. So it could be up to, I think, $8,000 toward the cost of an electric heat pump. So there's some direct subsidies for that switch, and that are in the Inflation Reduction Act. I think it'll be interesting to see how whether people choose to switch to electric heat pumps based on some of the tax credits or not, given the opportunities and availability from different contractors. I think that we'll definitely see a lot more cost-effective electric heating devices or HVAC systems.
Do you have any closing thoughts for us?
Yeah. So, I mean, climate change is a very urgent challenge, and I think the energy system is really influencing a lot of our ability to mitigate climate change. So, there are many different technologies. I wouldn't say there's one silver bullet solution, but we need to move quickly in terms of developing some of these enabling technologies like energy storage to really be able to meaningfully reduce our CO2 emissions on a large scale.
So you don't have a fully doomsday scenario, but we need to keep our eyes open and keep our focus laser pointed at the
There's
goal.
still, yeah. There's still hope, and now, I mean, I think there's also a lot of really interesting advances in the technologies, and a lot of them are now not only climate positive but also financially positive, and that they may reduce costs and allow people and businesses and utilities to save money. So that is could be a win-win.
Well, you put a lot of time into preparing for and presenting this program to us tonight. Certainly appreciate that. And I would tell you and the other people participating that we will post a recording of this session on YouTube within the next week or so. And thanks everyone